There is something curious about a mistake that arrives gently, without apology, without panic. It sits inside a thought like a misplaced star, subtle enough to be ignored, bright enough to disorient. You feel it before you see it, a quiet nudge at the edges of certainty. You were so sure, and then you weren't. What if some errors are not interruptions, but initiations? What if a well-placed error is not a deviation from wisdom, but the threshold into it? Beneath the polished surface of a coherent idea, there's often a seam, just visible enough to trace with your finger, like the edge of a hidden panel in a magician's table. We are taught to sand these down, to smooth over doubt until the story gleams. But it is within that seam where insight waits, coiled like a spring. Truth rarely announces itself, but error, placed with surgical precision, opens doors. It doesn't argue, it unsettles. It makes you feel the shape of your beliefs by denting them slightly. It draws the outline of the invisible structure you inhabit by poking a hole straight through it. You may think you're reasoning, but sometimes you're rehearsing. Thought loops, familiar grooves. The right answer comes too quickly. The applause in your mind is too loud. And then an error slips in, uninvited, a discordant note in your favorite song, a shadow on a trusted face. It makes everything hesitate. And in that hesitation, there is a clearing. Something can be rebuilt. Mistakes that last are often the ones that were too elegant to dismiss. They whisper something important, that the framework is flawed, not the thought, that being wrong in a precise way is closer to truth than being right by accident. A perfect answer to the wrong question still leads you nowhere, but a wrong answer to the right question, that's a map. Wisdom, if it ever visits, tends to wear the costume of contradiction. It does not align neatly with the furniture of your mind. It knocks it over, or better yet, rearranges it when you're not looking. You enter a room of thought you've been in before, but something's off. The chairs face a new direction. The windows lead to unfamiliar landscapes. That sensation is not confusion. That is the doorway. We often think of wisdom as the end point of thought, the summit, but it may be the collapse. The moment the scaffolding of your favorite certainty gives way, and you see not a fall, but sky. A well-placed error does not destroy your thinking. It releases it. It cracks the shell. It lets the air in. Sometimes wisdom arrives disguised as embarrassment. You notice the flaw not because someone pointed it out, but because you tripped over it mid-sentence. And in the awkward silence that follows, there is something sacred, an invitation to reassemble your reality with better pieces. There is a kind of intelligence that collects proofs, but there is another kind that collects questions. The first builds towers, the second leaves trails. The first sees errors as threats, the second sees them as lanterns. When you follow an error far enough, you eventually lose the map. That is when you begin to see the terrain. Our minds are biased toward coherence. We favor stories that wrap up neatly. But life is not loyal to narrative. A well-placed error resists closure. It keeps you open. It reminds you that sometimes the crack is not a weakness but an entry point, that the world might not be broken, only mislabeled. Not all mistakes are wise. Most are noise, fragments, echoes of exhausted systems, but now and then an error feels intentional, like it knew where it wanted to land. And when it lands, softly, subversively, it does not ask you to panic. It asks you to pause. Think of the first time you said something that made you uncomfortable. Not because it was false, but because it peeled something back. That discomfort wasn't error. It was exposure. And it was the beginning of clarity. We inherit thoughts the way we inherit furniture, useful, familiar, but not always ours. A well-placed error rearranges the room. It throws a lamp on the floor and says, "Look again. Do you still want to live here?" To live wisely is not to avoid being wrong. It is to build a deeper relationship with error, to recognize its rhythm, to notice the tone of its arrival, to distinguish the mistake that repeats from the one that reveals. Some mistakes echo, others break the loop. Eventually, the question becomes not, was it true, but what did the error make visible? The shape of our ignorance is the outline of our potential. The wisdom of a well-placed error is that it lets us see the shape of what we did not yet know how to ask. And in that space, where truth stumbles, where logic bends just slightly, something new becomes possible. The wisest errors are the ones that leave an afterimage, those you can't stop thinking about days later, long after the moment passed. They haunt, not because they wounded you, but because they illuminated you. They revealed something unprotected, something too close to the center. We speak often of learning, rarely of unlearning, but wisdom feeds on what is shed. It is not the accumulation of answers, but the erosion of false confidence, the slow grinding away of the masks we didn't know we were wearing. A well-placed error pulls at those masks, not to humiliate, but to let us breathe. At times, it is less a mistake and more a mutation, an irregularity the mind recoils from until it adapts, until the error is no longer wrong, but necessary, like the strange step in a dance that gives it soul, like the sour note that makes the melody honest. And so, wisdom does not always arrive clothed in truth. Sometimes it crawls in under the disguise of a misstep. It asks no loyalty, only attention. If you listen closely, you may find that the most graceful thoughts you've ever had began their lives as errors you refused to ignore. Not all deception is deliberate. Some of it grows from within, quietly, like ivy wrapping around a statue, until you forget what shape the stone used to have. The mind is not a vault of knowledge, but a theater of familiarity, and in this theater, thoughts dress for the role they want to play. A thought does not need to be true to be accepted. It only needs to feel right, to speak in the rhythm you're used to nod when you nod. We accept ideas not by testing their bones, but by sensing their temperature. And when something feels warm, aligned, pleasant, echoing the tone of our other beliefs, we call it truth. This is how thoughts learn to wear masks. They borrow the syntax of wisdom. They mimic the posture of reason. They arrive disguised as clarity. But beneath the surface, something else is moving: inertia, imitation, desire. There is a particular kind of idea that thrives because it sounds clever. It's not weighed, it's recited. We repeat it at parties, we quote it in meetings. We let it occupy space in our minds because it shines, not because it holds. And because it shines, it escapes scrutiny. We become attached to the performance of the thought, not its content. The masks are convincing. Some thoughts even learn to disguise themselves as doubts. They pretend to be skeptical, but only toward the right targets. They present themselves as the voice of reason, but only reason that protects an old certainty. You start to notice that even your critical thinking bends in familiar directions, always avoiding the same soft spots. We want to believe we are thinkers, but often we are rememberers. We're curators of inherited language, assembling comforting phrases into a collage that feels original, but isn't. Thoughts that wear masks of truth depend on this. They enter not by argument, but by resonance, and once inside, they change their names. They stop sounding like visitors. They start sounding like you. The illusion becomes complete when you can no longer tell the difference between thinking and echoing. A masked thought asks no questions of itself. It settles into the mind like furniture you never chose but learned to navigate around. It never disrupts your story. It harmonizes, and we are so attuned to harmony, so comforted by internal agreement, that we mistake it for understanding. You can build an entire worldview on such thoughts, a palace of coherence, with every idea reinforcing the next. It will feel whole. It will feel clean, but it will not be yours. Not really, because masked thoughts are ventriloquists. They speak through you, but they did not begin with you. And perhaps the strangest thing is how grateful we often are for these ideas. They offer relief from uncertainty. They offer narrative. They make the world manageable, but in doing so, they freeze it. They turn complexity into slogans. They turn ambiguity into slogans. They make living truths into dead metaphors. Some thoughts survive because they're beautiful, others because they're ancient. But neither beauty nor age makes them true. Only attention does, only interrogation, only the moment when you pause before agreeing with yourself. That moment, small, flickering, is where the mask slips. You hear a thought emerge from your mouth and realize it does not belong to you. Not fully, maybe not at all. You feel the distance between the language and the origin. You sense the muscle memory of belief, and in that space something breathes. The mask does not need to be ripped off. It only needs to be seen. You may not throw the thought away. You may even keep it. But now it is honest. It is yours by choice, not by inheritance. It stands without costume, without pose. Some masks are harder to remove. They were given to us early by teachers, by rituals, by books that glowed with the weight of tradition. These thoughts are tied to identity, to memory, to safety. To unpeeling them feels like betrayal. But wisdom does not ask you to betray anything. It asks you to notice. To ask why a certain sentence always makes you feel certain. To wonder what makes an idea feel like home. To explore why discomfort arrives when a familiar thought is questioned. The deeper you go, the more you begin to see the masks everywhere. Not as deceptions, but as defenses, as armor, as translation. The mind is not malicious in this, it is efficient. It wants to stabilize you, but in its effort to protect, it sometimes imprisons. It is tempting to treat every masked thought as a lie, but that would be another mask. Not all thoughts wearing truth's clothing are imposters. Some are simply unfinished. Some are true but lazy. Some are helpful illusions. What matters is whether you can hold them up to light and still find your own reflection beneath them. We don't need to live without masks. We need to know when they're being worn. The problem is not dressing a thought for the occasion. The problem is forgetting it ever dressed up. When you strip a thought of its performance, what remains? Does it wobble? Does it dissolve? Or does it stand, bare, imperfect, and real? That is a thought worth keeping. That is a thought that doesn't just sound true. It feels quiet in your hands. It doesn't demand agreement. It simply remains. You will still be fooled. We all are. That is part of being human. But if you practice noticing the mask, just noticing, then even your illusions begin to tell the truth. And that is where thought begins again, not with certainty, but with the grace to look twice. And yet the most dangerous mask is the one that flatters, the thought that tells you you're already wise, that there's nothing left to question. It wears your voice. It mirrors your style. It completes your sentence before you do. It is not bold. It is agreeable. And agreement, too easily won, is the velvet glove of stagnation. So ask, even gently, when did I stop being surprised by my own thinking? Which thoughts always arrive dressed in applause? Let the answer be uncomfortable. Let it breathe. The truth may not always be louder than the lie, but it never hides behind a costume. Confidence speaks first. It doesn't wait for the question to finish. It leaps forward, arms wide, voice certain, and declares something that sounds like truth. And because it sounds like truth, it is rarely challenged. The room goes quiet, and the conversation folds into it. But clarity does not arrive like that. Clarity walks in slower. It doesn't wear the same clothes. It's not charming. It doesn't raise its voice. It looks around, blinks once, and begins asking questions. The kind of questions that don't fit into timelines or agendas. The kind that ruin perfectly good conclusions. We live in a world that rewards speed. Speed of answer, speed of belief, speed of conviction. The person who responds fastest is assumed to know best. The one who pauses is mistaken for unprepared. The one who says, "I'm not sure," is forgotten entirely. But truth is not always fast. Sometimes it arrives late, breathless, full of doubt. Sometimes it waits behind silence, refusing to be summoned by certainty. Sometimes it speaks only when the noise has cleared. Confidence feels good. It feels like motion, like strength, like knowing. But it can be hollow, too. A polished shell around an unexamined idea, a practiced tone hiding a lazy thought, an inherited conviction wrapped in the costume of originality. We often forget how many wrong things have been said with absolute conviction, how many lies wore the mask of composure, how many errors were delivered with poise. We forget that belief can be stylish, that the appearance of knowing is not the same as knowing. Some people confuse confidence with insight, but confidence is a social tool. Insight is an internal excavation. One can be taught, the other must be earned. One fills silence with answers, the other learns to dwell inside the question. Clarity doesn't always win arguments. It doesn't always impress crowds. It doesn't dress itself up in certainty. It is awkward sometimes. Unfinished. It hesitates at the doorway before entering. It asks if it belongs. It reshapes itself as it speaks. There is nothing wrong with being confident. But there is danger in assuming confidence is proof. That because something is said boldly, it must be true. That because someone sounds like they understand, they must. That because we feel sure, we are. We are taught to trust the feeling of confidence, but feelings can be counterfeit. They can be rehearsed. They can be implanted by repetition. When we hear something enough times, it starts to wear the scent of clarity. But it's only been bathed in familiarity. clarity is harder to trust. That doesn't always come with a surge of assurance. Sometimes it arrives with discomfort. It makes you doubt the thing you wanted to be true. It asks you to give up the shape of a belief before you know what will replace it. And that's frightening. We don't like the empty space between unlearning and understanding, so we fill it, quickly, with anything that sounds right. Confidence is good at that. It builds bridges over gaps we were meant to fall into. But falling is where the clarity lives. To stand in not knowing and still be curious, that is the beginning of insight. To feel the pull of an easy answer and wait anyway. To hold a thought in your hand and rotate it slowly, looking for the places it resists pressure. That's where it cracks. That's where the light gets in. Confidence rarely looks back. It doesn't revisit what it already claimed. It wants to be right, not to learn. It fears the revision more than the error. But clarity is different. Clarity invites contradiction. It welcomes the chance to change shape. It is willing to be undone in service of something truer. You can watch this happen in real time. Watch how quickly we defend a confident idea, even when the evidence thins. Watch how discomfort rises not at the thought of being wrong, but at the thought of seeming unsure. Watch how often we trade understanding for composure. It is better, we think, to be wrong confidently than to be right uncertainly, because confidence sells, it organizes, it reassures. But clarity doesn't always soothe. Sometimes it disrupts. Sometimes it dismantles something beautiful you had built with borrowed tools. Confidence is not always dishonest, but it is incomplete. It is the surface of the water, not the depth. It reflects the sky but tells you nothing about what waits beneath. Clarity is the plunge, the dive into what resists description. You can fake confidence. You can imitate its tone, memorize its posture, replicate its rhythm. But you cannot fake clarity. Clarity leaves fingerprints. It moves differently. It leaves you changed. You can feel the difference. You can feel it in the aftermath of an idea. Did it settle into you like dust, or did it open something? Did it hold the door open for other thoughts, or did it shut them out? Did it echo, or did it evolve? Confidence is a signal to others. Clarity is a signal to yourself. And only one of them knows when the other is lying. There is no shame in not knowing. There is only shame in pretending. The most dangerous beliefs are the ones we never examine because they were delivered with confidence, the ones that sound good enough to escape the test. If you are unsure, say so. If a thought wavers, let it. If a belief shakes, listen. Clarity is not a destination. It is a relationship, a way of being with the world that allows it to surprise you. Let confidence speak if it must, but follow the thought that stumbles, the one that doubts its own structure, the one that returns to the same question, not out of confusion, but respect. Because clarity does not need applause, it does not need armor, it only needs a place where truth matters more than comfort. And when you find that quiet shape of something slowly understood, you will know, not because it felt certain, but because it changed you. Stories soothe us. They make chaos manageable. They carve beginnings and ends into places where there were none. They pull tension into lines we can follow with our fingers. We tell them to explain, to persuade, to remember. But most of all, we tell them to silence the unknown. The smoother the story, the more it slips past our doubts. It glides across the mind like water over glass, frictionless, elegant, complete. And because it feels complete, we stop asking questions, we stop looking underneath. We accept the shape it gives to experience and forget that it was shaped at all. The danger isn't that stories lie. The danger is that they fit. Too well, they wrap around our fears and hopes so precisely that we forget they had seams. A smooth story is a closed loop. No splinters, no ragged edges, no inconvenient details. But it is at the edges that reality begins to speak. A trap is most effective when it feels like safety, and the smoothest story is the one that doesn't feel like a story. It feels like truth. It explains so beautifully that it erases the need to investigate. We mistake the beauty of its structure for the accuracy of its content. We confuse emotional satisfaction with intellectual honesty. A story that moves without friction hides what it skips. The missing pieces aren't visible. They're erased. The contradictions are paved over. The complexity is compressed into symbols. And we carry these symbols like sacred objects, never questioning what was sacrificed to create them. The smoother the story, the more likely it has been polished to deceive. Not by others, but by ourselves. We sand down the rough spots of memory. We straighten the curves of uncertainty. We remove the hesitations that once made us human and replace them with conviction. And we love the feeling, we love the flow, the sense that it all adds up, that we've connected the dots, that the villain was always obvious, that the ending was inevitable. But nothing real is that tidy, nothing alive is that straight. Smooth stories sharpen over time. They cut off doubt. They slice through nuance. They divide the world into categories that feel clean but cost us insight. The more seamless the narrative, the more likely it's been stripped of contradiction. And contradiction is where reality lives. You can feel it when you speak it aloud, when the story tells itself too easily, when there is no hesitation, no ache of uncertainty. That's when you should pause. That's when you should wonder what you've lost in the pursuit of a perfect arc. Our need for meaning can be weaponized against us. The brain will assemble almost anything into a narrative. It will create heroes and enemies from fragments. It will paste coherence over confusion, like a child gluing stars to a night sky. And once the shape appears, we defend it, not because it's accurate, but because it's ours. We build identities on these stories. We inherit them. We rehearse them. We decorate them with certainty and hand them to others as gifts. But sometimes the story is not a gift. It's a cage made of familiar phrases, and we've lived inside it so long we call it a home. The truth is messier. It interrupts its own plot. It loops, forgets, contradicts. It refuses to stay resolved. And that discomfort, it's a sign, not of failure, but of fidelity. If your understanding of the world never leaves a bitter aftertaste, it's probably missing something. The smoother the story, the more dangerous the belief inside it. Because we stop seeing it as belief, we start seeing it as self-evident. We forget that someone told it first, that it came from somewhere, that it could have been told differently. The trap doesn't spring with a loud snap. It closes with a whisper, with a satisfying ending, with the kind of logic that feels like music. That's the sound of the lock clicking. You don't need to destroy the story, but you need to hold it lightly. You need to know where it was edited, where it was abridged, where it chose fluency over truth. Not all stories are traps, but the ones that glide too easily through your mind, the ones you find yourself repeating without effort, without question, those are the ones to watch. They're the ones that wear wisdom like a mask, the ones that smile as they tighten, the ones that smooth the way forward, while quietly closing the exits. We are pattern-seeking creatures in a world that rarely rewards raw perception. We crave the neat shape of cause and effect, the comfort of narrative glue. A smooth story doesn't just help us understand the world, it helps us feel in control of it. It tames the wildness of uncertainty into something we can explain at dinner. But that control is counterfeit. You've felt it before. The pleasure of retelling your past in a way that makes you look wise. You clip the indecision. You adjust the pacing. You invent motives after the fact, as if you always knew where the path would lead. And people nod because it sounds true, because it sounds like a story should. This is not manipulation, it's instinct. It's the mind's way of wrapping chaos in skin. And yet, what gets lost in the wrapping is often the most alive part of the experience. The confusion, the contradiction, the pieces that refuse to fit. A story that cannot make space for discomfort is not a reflection, it's an advertisement. It sells you back to yourself with all the blemishes airbrushed, and the smoother it gets, the harder it becomes to recognize the edits. Even memory obeys the pull of fluency. The rough edges of recollection are filed down over time until the past begins to rhyme too well with your present self. It becomes hard to imagine you ever thought differently, believed differently, wavered. But you did, and the truth lives there, in the parts that don't align, the moments that resist narration. Real understanding is shaped in those asymmetries, not smoothed over, but carried like a puzzle you never finish. So let the story stutter, let it lose its place, let it circle back, contradict itself, break form, because only then will you know you are telling something real. Logic promises us stability. If this, then that. Premise, conclusion, clean lines drawn across a landscape of doubt. It feels solid, like bricks placed with care. We walk across it with the confidence of someone who believes in the ground beneath their feet. But sometimes the ground remembers what it was before. Before it was paved with certainty, before it was named, before it was shaped into a road. Logic is not wrong. It is not false. It is only as true as the assumptions it stands on. And some of those assumptions are soft. They shift when you look at them too closely. They blur at the edges. They echo ideas you never chose, only absorbed. You follow the argument. You trace the steps. It all makes sense. But something feels off. You feel the floor move. Not loudly, not violently, but just enough to make you wonder if you're walking on earth or on the memory of something firmer. We build frameworks of thought like scaffolding around silence. But the first beam is often invisible. The first premise, unquestioned. And if the first step rests on something unspoken, the whole structure sways. Elegantly, quietly, with the illusion of balance. You can prove almost anything if you choose the right starting point. And we often choose starting points we don't even know we're choosing. Points inherited from culture, family, preference. Beliefs disguised as facts. values dressed as logic. The system holds until it doesn't, until it meets a question it cannot metabolize, until it is asked why, not how, until the quicksand under the first layer of reason starts to breathe. And then what do? Do you shore up the argument with better words, more elaborate structures, or do you pause and look down at what you've built your clarity on? Some logic is beautiful, precise, it reveals. But some logic is ornamental. It decorates a conclusion that was already decided. It exists to protect, not to discover, to affirm, not to challenge. You'll notice it in moments of disagreement, not in what's said, but in what's assumed. Two people arguing, each certain, each logical, each building castles on different sands. They cannot see each other because their roots are buried in separate soils. We call these debates, but they are often performances, choreographed expressions of beliefs already calcified. The appearance of reason wrapped around the absence of shared ground. There is a kind of courage in asking, what is this built on, especially when it's your own thought, especially when it's something you've leaned on for years. The invitation to collapse is terrifying, but collapse is not the end. It is a clearing. You can rebuild, with more awareness, with slower steps, with fewer assumptions pretending to be truths. Logic cannot save you from bad premises. It cannot protect you from your own unexamined agreements. But it can guide you if you let it walk backwards, if you follow it not toward the conclusion, but toward the beginning. We are so focused on being right that we forget to be grounded. But what good is being right in a house that sinks? What good is a tower of syllogisms if the soil beneath it whispers lies? Sometimes the most logical thing to do is stop arguing, not because you're wrong, but because the floor hasn't been checked. You don't have to abandon logic. You only have to remember that it's a tool, not a god, that it sharpens what you give it, but it cannot bless what you hide, that it builds, but it does not bless the foundation it rests on. You can feel it in your own thinking. When a thought arrives too smoothly, too quickly, with the shine of coherence, pause. Ask where it started. Ask what it's standing on. Ask what it refuses to see. Because logic is clean, but life is not. And if your logic never disagrees with your comfort, it may not be logic at all. It may be performance. It may be armor. The most dangerous thoughts are the ones that seem unbreakable, but everything can be questioned. And that is not weakness. It is the beginning of integrity. Let your reasoning breathe. Let it crack. Let it reveal the sand beneath your certainties, because what you find there may not be solid, but it will be real. We are taught to admire the shape of logic, its elegance, its symmetry, the way it unfolds like a well-written sentence, like a machine built to think for us. But even the most beautiful equation can be built on a whisper. Even the most precise argument can balance on a ghost. Sometimes we don't examine our logic because we're too enamored with how it feels. It gives us a sense of movement, of order. We follow the thread through the maze and mistake fluency for foundation. But clarity is not in the speed of the steps, it's in the ground beneath them. And sometimes logic becomes theater. We use it to legitimize instincts we've already decided to follow. We reverse engineer justification. We speak in diagrams and conclusions, not because we're curious, but because we are afraid of saying, "I don't know." There is power in admitting that. I don't know. not as a retreat, as an anchor. You can live there, you can think from there. It's not an absence of structure, it's a refusal to fake one. The mind is clever. It can disguise preference as principle. It can use logic as a disguise for fear. But fear, when rationalized, only becomes more convincing. You believe it more because it sounds like thought, because it wears a suit, because it passed inspection, your inspection written in your own hand. But what if your inspection checklist was written by the very belief you're trying to verify? That's the twist. That's the sink. Logic, when untethered from self-reflection, becomes a trap you build around yourself. And you decorate it. You name it perspective. You call it wisdom. But you never open the floor. To begin again, you don't need to destroy your thinking. You only need to ask it where it sleeps. Some ideas do not look like warnings when they arrive. They do not hiss or rattle or wear dark robes. They show up in quiet voices, in structured thoughts, in sentences that fit neatly into conversations. They smile as they enter. They wear reason like a uniform. And because they sound familiar, we let them stay. A terrible idea doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't need to. It survives not by being outrageous, but by being plausible, by echoing the rhythm of intelligence, by slipping into our patterns of thinking like a note that almost harmonizes. It feels right enough. It feels calm. And so we trust it. But reason can be borrowed. Logic can be mimicked. The surface of a thought can be shaped to look like clarity, even when its core is hollow. And when something sounds reasonable, we hesitate to question it. Because questioning reason itself feels dangerous, like sawing through the branch you're sitting on. We crave structure. We crave sense. And when something provides both, we don't look too hard at the foundation. But sometimes that structure is built on rot. Sometimes the sense it makes is circular. Sometimes what feels like understanding is just the absence of friction. Terrible ideas survive because they are easy to repeat, because they come prepackaged in the voice of authority, because they make themselves useful. They offer shortcuts. They answer complicated questions with simple phrases. They make complexity feel manageable. But the price of that smoothness is depth. You have believed one. You might still. Not because you are unwise, but because terrible ideas are excellent at hiding. They embed themselves in systems, in language, in the seams of what you've already accepted. They do not live in extremes. They nest in the middle, in the places you thought were neutral. And when they are well dressed, no one wants to undress them. No one wants to be the first to say, "This sounds true, but feels wrong," because feelings can be dismissed. But sound logic, that is harder to question, even when it leads you somewhere you'd never choose to go. The worst ideas don't need to lie. They only need to be efficient. They only need to match the shape of your existing beliefs. If they rhyme with what you've already said, you won't notice that they never made sense. You'll defend them because you've already used them. And we protect the tools we've built with, even when they cut us. There is a difference between something that is logical and something that is wise. Wisdom requires context. Logic does not. Logic can be cruel and still be correct. It can follow its steps flawlessly, right into absurdity, right into harm, right into history. You can build a system on a terrible idea. You can codify it, legislate it, normalize it. You can pass it from one generation to the next and call it tradition. And the longer it survives, the more visible it becomes, the more natural it feels, the more it sounds like common sense. But common sense is not a compass, it's a habit, a well-worn trail. And sometimes it leads nowhere new. Terrible ideas wear the reasonable tone because they don't want to be seen. They want to blend in. They want to be spoken aloud without hesitation. They want to be believed before they are heard. You've heard one recently. You may have nodded, you may have agreed, and in that moment it didn't feel like danger. It felt like agreement. It felt like finally someone said it cleanly. But there is a cost to that kind of ease. When an idea feels too smooth, too finished, too precise, pause. Ask what it isn't saying. Ask what it's stepping over. Ask who it's leaving behind. Not all terrible ideas are loud. Some are quiet because they've already won. Because they no longer need to persuade you. They only need you to keep repeating them, automatically, unconsciously, like a script written by someone you never met. A beautiful sentence can carry a broken thought. A well-reasoned essay can defend a hollow premise. A confident voice can lead a crowd straight into the dark. Listen closely. Even the worst ideas can be spoken gently. Even poison can sound like a lullaby. Even a lie can wear a suit and carry a chart. Even your own voice, with all its logic, can be mistaken for truth. And still, it sounds so reasonable. That's the trap. That's the signal. That's when you should listen harder. Not to the tone, but to the silence beneath it. It's not just the words that mislead. It's the structure beneath them, the rhythm of familiarity, the comfort of tidy conclusions. We fall into agreement before we realize we've stepped over a question. We call it logic, but sometimes it's just choreography. We know the moves, we've practiced them, and now they dance us. A terrible idea reinforced by enough repetition becomes indistinguishable from instinct. It no longer feels external. It feels like common sense. But common is not the same as earned, and sense is not the same as truth. We forget this because the idea speaks our language. It flatters our thinking style. It arrives already wearing our clothes. Terrible ideas don't shout because they don't need to. They rely on our exhaustion, on our craving for resolution. They wait at the edges of big questions and offer quick exits. They offer certainty instead of curiosity, safety instead of reflection. And we're so relieved to have something that sounds clear, we stop wondering if it's actually true. Even doubt can be wrapped in their voice. Even our inner questions can be rehearsed. We mistake repetition for rigor. We confuse polish with process. But real thinking doesn't always sound clean. It stutters, it recoils, it doubles back. And when it does, let it. Let yourself stay in the place where an idea is still forming, where it hasn't yet learned how to perform. Because in that unfinished space, you might finally hear something that doesn't just sound reasonable, but asks you to become more. Certainty doesn't always come from understanding. Sometimes it grows by accident, out of repetition, out of timing, out of the strange momentum of agreement. One person says it, another echoes it. Soon it becomes architecture. Soon it becomes a fact no one remembers learning. We imagine our beliefs as conclusions, carefully constructed, deliberate, tested. But many are not. Many are byproducts of something smaller. A throwaway phrase, a headline, a childhood overhearing. a sentence spoken in authority's voice, never questioned because it felt too early to ask. It begins quietly. One idea sticks because it was the first one. The brain likes firsts. It remembers them longer. It returns to them faster. The first belief feels truer, not because it is, but because it got there first. And once it's there, it begins to solidify, not through proof, but through presence. You build thoughts on top of it. You attach stories. You make sense around it. Eventually, it becomes the floor of the house, the thing all other things stand on. And you forget it was ever chosen. You forget it came from somewhere. Some certainties are not decisions. They are leftovers, fossils of emotion, echoes of someone else's fear. They calcify with time. They become structural. And the longer they go unexamined, the more real they feel. This is the architecture of accidental belief. It does not announce itself. It does not ask permission. It simply settles into your narrative and stays there, quiet, useful, unquestioned. You may even defend it. You may wrap logic around it like insulation. You may build arguments to protect it without ever knowing what you're protecting. And when someone pulls at it, you don't feel challenged. You feel attacked. Because it's not just a belief anymore. It's part of your sense of coherence. It holds the other pieces in place. If it wobbles, everything else might move. And so you guard it without knowing why. You become the defender of a thing you didn't consciously choose. You become the voice for an idea that never asked to be tested. And when others question it, you feel a strange kind of shame, as if your entire structure was suddenly made of glass. This is not a flaw. It's a feature. The mind protects its architecture, even if it was built hastily, even if the materials were borrowed, even if the original reason for building it has long been forgotten. The question is not whether you have these certainties. You do. We all do. The question is whether you're willing to ask where they came from, whether you're willing to ask why they still feel true, whether you're willing to sit in the discomfort of disassembling something you didn't know you had built. This is how you find the invisible scaffolding. You trace the feeling of resistance. You follow the moment you say, "Of course," and ask why. You listen to the silence that follows a belief that can't explain itself. It's hard. It's disorienting. It can feel like forgetting your own name. But it's also a return. Not to certainty, but to choice. To believe something again. Not because it was inherited. Not because it's useful. Not because it's loud. But because it has survived your own inspection. Certainty that has never been questioned is not strength. It's sediment. But certainty that has broken and rebuilt itself, that has endured being doubted, that has cracked open and held steady through revision. That kind of certainty doesn't silence others. It listens. It doesn't demand belief. It invites it, and it no longer fears being wrong, because it remembers how it was made. You don't remember the moment you believed it. That's part of the problem. It didn't arrive with ceremony. It wasn't earned like truth. It just appeared, smuggled in through repetition, passed hand to hand like a shared superstition. And now it lives inside you, not as a guest, but as part of the furniture. This kind of certainty is sticky. It hides beneath phrases like "obviously" and "everyone knows." It weaves itself into how you speak, how you argue, how you explain yourself to others. You reach for it without thinking. It has become a reflex. and in the space between reflex and awareness it gains power. When enough people repeat a belief, it takes on the weight of reality. Not because it is true, but because truth starts to feel like what echoes. You hear it from enough directions and the mind stops asking where it started. That's when a belief becomes ambient, atmospheric, a shape the air takes. You may only notice it when it's challenged, when someone names it out loud, when someone asks why. Not with hostility, but with genuine curiosity, and suddenly you feel it, the friction, the heat behind your eyes, the urge to defend even if your hands are empty. That's when you know you've found something old, something inherited, something that grew like moss across your worldview while you were busy being human. This is not a call to distrust everything. It's not a suggestion to peel back every layer until only emptiness remains. You cannot live without beliefs. You cannot move through a day without some working model of the world. But there is a difference between holding a belief and being held by one. There is a difference between standing on something and being buried under it. Sometimes the only way to test your certainty is to loosen your grip, to ask gently whether it still serves you, whether it ever did, whether it is yours, or something you're still carrying for someone else. And if you find that it's hollow, let it go. You are not less whole without it. You are not less wise. You are not lost. You are simply aware for the first time that the ground beneath your thinking was once chosen and can be chosen again. Bad ideas don't always sound sharp. Some hum softly in the dark like lullabies. They don't shake you awake. They sing you to sleep. They wrap themselves in warmth and rhythm and nostalgia. They don't challenge. They soothe. They offer the illusion of understanding without the burden of thought. You hear them when you're tired, when the world feels too complicated, when questions demand more than you have to give. They arrive like comfort food for the mind, easy to swallow, pre-chewed, familiar, and in that familiarity they sedate your attention. They blur the outlines of better thinking. Bad ideas don't persist because they're powerful. They persist because they're easy, because they feel nice, because they ask nothing of you but to agree. And agreement feels like rest. It feels like finally being done. But some ideas should keep you up at night. Some truths are uncomfortable because they are alive. A good idea doesn't lull. It stirs. It irritates before it reveals. It asks you to stay awake inside it. But bad ideas cradle you. They repeat themselves in gentle loops. They erase nuance with phrases you've heard too many times. It's always been this way. That's just how people are. Everything happens for a reason. Sentences that close doors instead of opening them. Ideas that offer peace. Not because they're true, but because they've stopped the noise. You don't even realize how long you've been singing them to yourself, how often you've passed them to others as kindness, how deeply they've etched themselves into your sense of calm. They don't scream, they don't cut, they hum and they wait. They wait in classrooms, in media, in conversations where no one wants to argue, in the parts of you that crave relief more than accuracy, and they're always ready to take your hand, always ready to tell you, "Shh, you already know the answer, don't look too hard." And when you try to question them, they play back their melody, software familiar. Slightly sad, they remind you that being uncertain is exhausting, that curiosity takes effort, That peace is found in accepting what you've been told. This is how they stay alive. They offer you stillness that isn't earned, closure that wasn't reached, a worldview that is soft at the edges, where all the hard questions have already been answered by someone else. You can live like that. Many do. You can decorate your thinking with lovely phrases that don't ask anything new of you. You can float on ideas that feel safe, feel right, feel worn in. But eventually, you'll wake to find that the ideas you trusted have stopped evolving, that they've become your ceiling, that they no longer carry you forward. They just rock you in place. And that's when the lullaby begins to sound different. Off-key, circular, too smooth. That's when you notice that comfort can be a trap. Not all comfort is false, but if comfort comes too easily, too early in the process of understanding, pause. Ask what you've skipped. Ask who benefits from your calm. Ask if what you believe is singing you to sleep instead of waking you up. Truth doesn't always feel gentle. Sometimes it arrives with friction, with discomfort, with questions you don't yet know how to hold. But that's how you know it's breathing. That's how you know it's real. There is a way to rest inside reality, but it isn't quiet at first. It doesn't come wrapped in certainty. It comes with the sound of old ideas falling apart. So listen carefully. Some lullabies are meant to keep you still. Some are meant to carry you through the night. And some are meant to be outgrown. A bad idea can sound wise if it rhymes with your longing. If it arrives when you're tired, when you're fragile, when you're just looking for something to hold on to. It wraps itself in the language of reassurance. It says just enough to stop the spinning, not enough to move you forward. And when you've heard it enough times, you begin to mistake stillness for wisdom. You begin to believe that quiet is the same as truth, that comfort is the same as clarity. But the deepest truths aren't always quiet. Some truths arrive shaking, some truths leave splinters, some truths make you stay up at night replaying the thought you tried not to have. That's not noise. That's awareness knocking at your walls. A lullaby is meant to end the day, but when bad ideas take that shape, they end the questioning. They teach you to settle. They reward you for your resignation. They teach you to stop, not because you've found something, but because it's easier than looking. And in that ease, bad ideas multiply. They breed in agreement. They pass from voice to voice under the guise of normalcy. You hear them in policy. You hear them in cliches. You hear them in the way people avoid discomfort by saying something just true enough to stop the conversation. Sometimes they come from love. A parent trying to soothe a child. A friend trying to help you breathe. But even love can deliver a lie when it cannot hold your uncertainty. Even kindness can carry a bad idea if it values comfort more than growth. The danger isn't in having bad ideas. Everyone does. The danger is in giving them rhythm, in setting them to music, in letting them become the song you sing when the world becomes too loud. So listen not just to what a belief says, but how it sings. Listen for the loop. Listen for the melody that asks nothing new of you. Then listen harder for the silence waiting underneath. Because that silence is not absence. It is invitation. It is the space where something unimagined might begin to hum. Some things arrive in the mind without introduction. No explanation, no memory, no argument. They're just there. And because they feel immediate, We assume they must be true. This is how it begins, the illusion of insight that never had to earn its place. You don't know how you know, only that you do. And that is the most convincing lie. To just know is to live inside a thought that evaded inspection. It doesn't ring alarms. It doesn't feel suspicious. It settles into the body like muscle memory. It becomes indistinguishable from instinct. But instinct is not always wise. Sometimes it is repetition wearing a new name. Sometimes it is the voice of someone else still echoing in your tone. You think you're standing on solid ground, but you never checked the floor. The idea arrived so smoothly, so early, so quietly, that you mistook its comfort for clarity. You didn't question it, not because it was beyond doubt, but because doubt never got the chance to speak. That silence, polished and calm, is not proof. It is absence. Bad ideas rarely shout. The most enduring ones hum. They match your rhythm. They fold into your routines. They feel like something you would have thought anyway. But the mind is not always the source. It is a vessel, a chorus. And sometimes what feels original is just the loudest residue of what you've heard the most. To just know is to skip the question, to prefer ease over excavation. It offers safety, but only the kind that dulls the blade of awareness, because what you just know is rarely yours. It is stitched together from fragments, upbringing, television, overheard conversations, casual authority, each thread added without consent until the shape feels complete. But feeling complete is not the same as being right. The mind is very good at finishing what it never started. It fills the blanks with coherence. It colors in what should remain undefined. And over time, it forgets the boundaries. You forget that there was ever a moment before knowing. This kind of certainty becomes the architecture of thought. Not because it's true, but because it's quiet, because it fits without friction, because it never had to survive the heat of contradiction. It just arrived, nodded politely, and unpacked its things. You tell yourself it's intuition. You call it experience. But intuition is not immune to error, and experience is often shaped by unexamined patterns. To mistake familiarity for truth is to live in a house built on fog, and when someone questions what you just know, you feel it, an irritation, a subtle tightening. Not because they've offended reason, but because they've touched something tender, something that lives too close to who you think you are. You want to defend it, but you don't know where to begin, because it never explained itself to you either. That is the trap. A belief that feels self-evident becomes a belief that feels self. And to remove it is to imagine yourself unraveling. But you are not your thoughts. You are not your reflexes. You are not the story that arrived before you could write your own. To be wise is not to know more. It is to know what you do not know, to know where your knowing ends, to notice the places where certainty arrived suspiciously early and never had to knock, to return to those moments and ask again. Some of what you just know will survive the question. It will stand, not because it is loud, but because it has depth, because it can explain its shape, because it was never afraid of being asked. But some will fall apart in your hands. And in that falling, something honest will begin. You will not collapse with it. You will not vanish. You will emerge. Lighter, more alert, more yours. Knowing without knowing why is not always dangerous, but it is always unfinished, and you deserve to finish your thoughts, not just inherit them. not just absorb them, but walk them backward until you find the first step and choose it. There's a kind of relief in saying, I just know. It closes the door. It ends the conversation. It makes you feel safe, untouchable. It tells the world you've arrived at the truth and there is nothing more to be done. But that arrival is often a shortcut, a well-lit sign placed over unfinished construction. We are rewarded for certainty, praised for confidence. People trust the person who doesn't flinch. But not all stillness is strength. Sometimes stillness is the absence of motion where motion was needed. Sometimes it is the quiet hum of an idea that never had to stretch. There are ideas we inherit without noticing. They travel with us like air. We build other ideas on top of them, layering belief on belief until the base disappears from view. And when we reach for clarity, we mistake the polished upper floor for a solid foundation. But if we were to dig, if we dared to reach beneath the surface, we'd find much of what we stand on was poured in haste, or not at all. The danger is not in having unexamined beliefs. That is inevitable. The danger is in defending them without knowing their origin, in protecting something simply because it feels internal. But feeling is not evidence. Comfort is not a compass. And intuition, when left unchallenged, can harden into blindness. To challenge what you just know is not betrayal, it is repair. It is a return to the moment where something entered you without invitation. It is asking with humility, why does this feel so final? Why does this idea resist being touched? If the answer recoils, if it cannot bear the weight of your attention, it may not be as true as it felt. Beliefs that survive your questioning become stronger, not louder, but steadier. They don't insist, they rest. They no longer require armor because they have earned their place. And those that don't survive, let them fall. You will not vanish without them. You will only become more awake. You will begin to feel the difference between what you just know and what you have truly come to understand. We tend to look upward when we feel lost, toward voices raised slightly above the crowd, toward names etched into the air with reverence, toward titles, toward stages, toward heights. We assume that altitude reveals something truer, that the higher the voice, the deeper the insight, that the one above us must see more. But not all elevation comes from understanding. Not all visibility is vision. Some rise because they repeat the right things in the right tone. Some are lifted not for what they say, but how cleanly they fit the structure. Their words arrive dressed like wisdom, but carry the hollowness of performance. We mistake the poise for perspective, the calm for clarity, the polish for proof. But wisdom is not always smooth. It stumbles, it breaks its own rules, it contradicts itself, then pauses to listen. False wisdom rarely does that. It moves forward with confidence that resists reflection. It sounds complete, too complete. There is a kind of language that knows how to dress like insight. It borrows the cadence of depth. It uses ambiguity like incense. It says little, but says it elegantly. And we applaud it because it feels like thinking, because it relieves us from having to do our own. We are trained to recognize wisdom by its posture, a certain slowness, a certain vocabulary. But these too can be learned. They can be mimicked. They can be adopted like style. And once learned, they can be sold. You may not notice it at first. You nod, you agree, you feel the weight of what was said. but you cannot repeat it without reaching for the tone. That is the sign. When the wisdom cannot stand without the voice that spoke it, something is wrong. The highest places are not always earned. Sometimes they are inherited. Sometimes they are bought. Sometimes they are built on sand and sealed with applause. But applause is not a measure of truth. It is a sound we make when something fits our expectations. And false wisdom is excellent at fitting expectations. It tells you what you already believe, but more beautifully, it says the thing you've heard before, with better rhythm. It flatters your existing worldview while pretending to expand it. It gives you the feeling of growth without requiring change. That is its genius. It never challenges. It never reaches into the discomfort. It glides over the cracks. It points to mystery, but never enters it. It quotes depth, but never descends. And we accept it, because it makes us feel wise just for listening. But real wisdom doesn't flatter. It unsettles. It draws you inward, not upward. It asks for silence, not performance. It shows you something about yourself that does not resolve easily. It is not wrong to learn from those in high places, but do not mistake the height for the source. Do not assume the microphone is proof. Do not confuse reputation with reflection. Ask instead, can this wisdom survive without the stage? Can it be whispered and still be true? Can it walk barefoot without a podium, without the framing of prestige? You may find that the truest things are spoken in quieter places, away from light, away from applause, in rooms with no audience. False wisdom resists questions. It relies on trust, not transparency. It prefers to be quoted, not explored. It wants to be believed, not tested, and it thrives in the space between admiration and inquiry. You are allowed to admire, but do not forget to listen past the surface. Do not forget to ask what's missing, what's unsaid, what part of the truth was edited out to keep it palatable. Not every elevated voice is false, but all true voices welcome being lowered. All true voices survive being questioned. All true voices can sit beside you and still speak the same words. And when you find such a voice, not high but human, not flawless but awake, you will recognize the difference, not by how loud it speaks, but by how deeply it listens. False wisdom is rarely born from malice. It is often grown in systems that reward certainty more than sincerity. A thought polished until it shines is easier to sell than one that trembles in its truth. So we learn to speak with authority before we learn to sit with ambiguity. We learn to be convincing before we learn to be clear. And the world listens to what is well delivered. We are drawn to symmetry, to the cadence of answers that sound like they've already been tested. We want to be told that someone else has seen further, felt deeper, resolved what we are still tangled in. So we nod, we underline, we share the quote, we carve it into digital stone, and never once ask, what if the insight was just noise in a beautiful voice? False wisdom becomes dangerous not when it fails, but when it succeeds, when it becomes a model, when others imitate it, when it becomes the new accent of thoughtfulness, and soon the requirement for being heard. Thought becomes posture. Depth becomes fashion. Truth becomes something that sounds like truth. And then it becomes difficult to say anything simple, anything unpolished, anything that hasn't rehearsed its own impact. because the audience now expects a certain rhythm, a certain glow, a certain style of depth that arrives ready-made and already framed. But wisdom is not a product. It cannot be packaged. It resists being finished. It is something you return to over and over, not because it comforts, but because it doesn't let you go. False wisdom ends the conversation. Real wisdom begins it. So be suspicious of what feels too settled. Be suspicious of what makes you feel like you already understand. Be suspicious of anything that answers without offering room for your own experience to unfold. Because truth doesn't always shine. Sometimes it stumbles out awkwardly, carrying more questions than revelations. Sometimes it isn't spoken at all, but felt quietly between the words. And when you finally hear something that doesn't need a high place to be heard, you will feel it not in your agreement, but in your willingness to stay with it long after the applause has faded. Some minds move quickly. They build bridges in seconds, connect thoughts across continents of complexity, weave facts into architecture with ease. They sound like certainty. They echo with sharpness. They respond before the question is fully formed. And we call this brilliance. But speed is not the same as depth, and sharpness is not the same as clarity. A smart mind can assemble a flawless defense for a hollow idea. It can win arguments without touching the truth. It can dress bias in the language of data, clothe fear in logic, weaponize cleverness into conviction. And it can be wrong, faster, louder, more eloquently than anyone else in the room. We are dazzled by intelligence. We mistake fluency for insight. When someone speaks with precision, we lean in. We assume their clarity of speech must reflect clarity of thought. But some of the most polished thoughts are only rehearsed instincts. Some of the fastest answers are just rehearsed shortcuts. A fast mind learns to skip the part where doubt lives. It accelerates past the silence. It avoids the ache of not knowing. But wisdom is often slow. It walks with a limp. It pauses at the middle of its own sentences. It circles the question without needing to conquer it. Being smart can become a trap. The smarter you are, the easier it is to protect your errors. The easier it is to justify what you already believe. You build intellectual armor around emotional habits. You become harder to correct, not because you're more right, but because you're more convincing. The world rewards speed. It rewards coherence. It rewards certainty wrapped in elegant phrasing. But wisdom doesn't always move in straight lines. It spirals. It doubles back. It contradicts itself and then sits beside the contradiction to learn from it. When you're smart, you learn to win. But winning isn't always knowing. Winning can be domination disguised as insight. It can be volume dressed as vision. The mind rushes ahead and leaves the soul behind. And once you've won an argument with an idea you didn't examine, you carry that idea with pride. Even if it's wrong, even if it hurts, even if it shrinks you. The smarter you are, the more dangerous your unexamined thoughts can become. Because no one stops you. Because everyone assumes you've already done the work. Because you know how to make anything sound like it belongs. But truth doesn't care how fast you arrive. It waits where you slowed down. It lingers in the questions you skipped. It hums in the spaces between your conclusions. And intelligence, untempered by humility, misses it. To think well is not to think quickly. It is to be present with the thought, to hold it up to light, to turn it slowly, to ask, where did you come from? What do you serve? Who do you leave out? Smart minds often ask how. Wise minds ask why. Smart minds build the system. Wise minds test the ground beneath it. Smart minds say, here's the answer. Wise minds say, let's stay with the question. If you're used to being the fastest mind in the room, you may not notice when you're sprinting in circles. You may not see that what you call insight is just inertia, that what you call analysis is just armor. Because intelligence can become a performance, one that others clap for, one that earns respect. But not every performance deserves an encore. Not every sharp answer deserves applause. There is another way to be smart. It is quieter. It does not rush. It listens to the argument it disagrees with. Not to defeat it, but to understand where it begins. It is a mind that allows itself to be wrong, a mind that asks, what am I missing? Not to appear humble, but because it is, because it knows. That being smart is not the same as being awake. That being clever is not the same as being honest. That being right too quickly might mean you're standing on an answer you've never dared to test. So pause. Let your thoughts slow down. Let the question linger a little longer. Let silence speak back to you. Because real insight is not how fast you think, it's how deeply you're willing to stop. The hardest minds to reach are often the brightest, not because they're unwilling, but because they've built so many elegant defenses. The mind learns to protect itself with precision. It learns to fold every doubt into a new conclusion, to answer every challenge with a sharper blade. But some truths can't be argued into, they must be felt. And feeling requires slowness. Being smart teaches you to seek efficiency. But the soul resists shortcuts. It does not move at the speed of explanation. It needs space. Space to not know. Space to break apart. Space to change shape without having to win. What looks like intelligence on the surface can sometimes be fear beneath it. Fear of being wrong. Fear of appearing lost. Fear of not having the words when the silence asks for honesty instead. If you are always sure, always quick, always right, you might be missing the point. Not because you lack the mind to understand, but because you've never let your mind be still long enough to be truly changed. And that is where wisdom waits, not ahead of you, not above you, but behind the thought you dismissed too quickly, the one that asked you to slow down. There are thoughts that arrive with weight. They feel sharp, illuminating, fresh. They pull the world into focus. And because the sensation is immediate, we believe the thought must be true. Insight is supposed to feel like that, like a sudden clearing in the fog, but not every clearing leads somewhere real. Sometimes the fog lifts just enough to reveal a mirage. This is how a mistake hides itself, by mimicking the emotional tone of truth, by dressing itself in the body language of revelation. It feels like you've discovered something. It feels like you've woken up. But what you've found might be a story crafted to soothe, to simplify, to protect a belief you weren't ready to lose. We mistake the feeling of insight for the presence of wisdom, but feelings can be counterfeited by the brain, especially when they arrive at the end of struggle, confusion, or pain. The relief becomes the proof. The resolution becomes the evidence. The sudden coherence makes you certain, and certainty is the last thing that asks questions. The mind is clever. It can take a half-truth and shape it into a revelation. It can bend memory around a belief until everything lines up, until the mistake no longer looks like a mistake. It looks like an answer. You don't notice it at first. It speaks in your voice. It supports what you already suspect. It rewards you with clarity. And it begins to glow, a thought with its own spotlight. You build on it, you teach it, you pass it along like something holy. But insight that cannot be doubted is not insight. It's dogma with better lighting. A real insight humbles you. It stretches you. It carries discomfort. It reminds you how much you still don't know. But a mistaken insight feels more like closure. It seals the room. It locks the door and says, "You've seen enough." It flatters the part of you that wants to stop searching. And sometimes it works. It gets you through a moment. It gives you a narrative. It explains a loss. It gives shape to grief, or anger, or confusion. And that is its kindness. Even mistakes can be kind. But that does not make them true. You can carry a false insight for years. It can become the foundation of a worldview. It can color how you interpret others, how you explain yourself, how you prepare for things that never come. And all the while, it remains unchallenged, because it still feels right. But feeling right is not a guarantee. Feeling right is often just feeling finished, and finishing is not the same as understanding. The most dangerous thoughts are the ones that comfort you as they close the window, that leave you with no questions, only confidence, that make you feel like you finally see clearly when you've only put on a more convincing pair of blinders. And yet, this is not a call to distrust everything you learn. Some insights are real, some arrive softly and still break you open, but you know them by what they leave behind. Not certainty, but spaciousness. Not satisfaction, but silence. They don't rush to be shared. They settle into you, slow and strange. They make you pause. They invite contradiction. They feel less like a prize, and more like a beginning. So ask yourself, what belief have I never doubted because it came with the glow of understanding? What part of me was too relieved to look again? Sometimes the mistake that feels like insight was born not from clarity but from exhaustion, from the ache of not knowing, from the need to feel whole. But truth doesn't arrive to soothe, it arrives to awaken. And awakening is not always graceful. It is the slow erosion of a story you thought would protect you. It is the soft collapse of an answer that no longer makes sense. It is the echo of a voice inside saying, "You were close. Try again." Let yourself try again, even when the answer felt perfect, even when the insight sang in your bones. Because the truth is not always what you feel. It is what remains. When you dare to feel past it. Insight is seductive. It offers a high, the thrill of a sudden understanding. You feel clever. You feel powerful. You feel like you've just stepped behind the curtain of the world. But not every curtain hides a deeper truth. Some hide more curtains. Some just open to a mirror. A mistake can become insight if it arrives at the right emotional temperature, if it resonates with your need for control, if it punctuates your suffering with an explanation, however incomplete. That resonance becomes conviction, and conviction, left unexamined, becomes identity. You don't realize how much of your mind is built around the first thought that made you feel wise. But if you trace it back, if you walk through the corridors of your reasoning, You might find that the foundation is soft, that the bricks were feelings, not facts, that what you believed was an anchor was really a buoy, keeping you afloat in a storm. And maybe that was enough, for a time. But wisdom begins when you stop asking, "Does this feel profound?" and start asking, "Does this survive being held up to the light?" Because the truth doesn't shimmer. It stays, even when the glow fades. Some lies are not shouted. They are whispered, elegantly, through the hollow of reason. They wear cleverness like armor. They arrive with timing, with rhythm, with style, and we believe them, not because we are fooled, but because we admire the craftsmanship. A clever lie doesn't demand belief, it suggests it. It offers a shortcut through ambiguity, a ladder across contradiction. It sounds like something you might have said if you'd only thought of it first. And so, you borrow it, you try it on, you keep it. We think lies must feel wrong, but some feel precisely right. They speak with your voice. They know your habits. They wrap around the parts of you that are already aching for answers. And in that comfort, the lie echoes. Echoes don't announce their origin. They repeat until origin becomes irrelevant. A clever lie becomes a structure, a tone, a presence. It filters through institutions, through language, through the way we frame questions before we ask them. It moves faster than correction. It spreads in fragments until there's no one left to remember where it started. You may carry one now, not in your mouth but deeper, in the shape of a thought you haven't touched in years, in the background music of a belief you've never said aloud. You trust it because it has always been there. But always is not the same as true. The most seductive lies are the ones that don't feel like lies at all, the ones that offer coherence, the ones that sound mature, responsible, worldly, the ones that get repeated by those who speak with gravity. They don't insult your intelligence. They flatter it. You learn to quote them, to teach them, to pass them forward without knowing what you're carrying. And every time they're repeated, they grow a little more invisible. They calcify into wisdom, into tradition, into the kind of truth no one thinks to question. But if you listen closely, you can still hear it, the echo, that strange distance in a phrase that feels too practiced, that subtle lack of origin in an idea that comes too easily, that hum of borrowed certainty. That's where the lie hides, in the echo that never ends. Some clever lies don't collapse when challenged. They evolve, they adapt, they borrow your objections and use them to reinforce their form. They know how to survive disagreement. They feed on it, because every repetition, even in resistance, keeps them alive. This is the echo's trick. It doesn't need to be believed by everyone. It only needs to stay moving. It only needs to sound close enough to the truth that questioning it feels like nitpicking. And so it slips through, again and again. But you can feel the difference. You can feel it in your chest. In the way a thought lands without resonance. In the way a belief feels airtight but hollow. In the way you reach for it out of habit, not conviction. To break the echo, you must first stop speaking. You must trace the sound backwards. Through the chambers of repetition, through the admiration, through the comfort. Back to the place where someone first needed a shortcut, where someone traded truth for cleverness. You may find it was not born of malice, just timing, just elegance, just the human need to explain something too large, too raw, too slow. But a lie told to survive still echoes. A lie that helped you feel safe can still keep you small. The test is not whether the thought makes sense. Many lies make perfect sense. The test is whether the thought opens something in you or closes it, whether it allows for contradiction, whether it lets you breathe. A clever lie resists expansion. It resists the question it cannot answer. It loops, it flatters, it performs. A true thought, however awkward, however slow, does not echo. It rings, and when it's done, it makes room for what comes next. It doesn't need to be remembered, because it stays. The echo does not require permission. It does not ask for your belief. It only asks that you repeat. It moves not by conviction, but by rhythm, by social cues, by the desire to sound like you know. And when everyone around you is echoing the same polished sentence, silence feels like ignorance. So you speak. You join the rhythm. You become another chamber the lie passes through. And each time it touches another voice, it gathers more weight. Not weight from meaning, weight from repetition. It becomes too heavy to question, too embedded to remove without tearing something else. But repetition is not verification. Familiarity is not trust, and beauty is not proof. A clever lie knows how to hide inside the words we admire most. It hides inside nuance. It hides inside balance. It hides inside the claim that nothing can really be known. It pretends to be perspective, when all it really wants is immunity. Even in the face of contradiction, the echo survives, because it doesn't need your full agreement, only your hesitance to challenge it, only your exhaustion, only your fear of seeming naive. That's where it thrives, in the quiet between truth and politeness. The cleverest lies are the ones that make you feel wise for believing them. They dress up skepticism as insight. They teach you to look down on simplicity, to treat emotional clarity as intellectual weakness. They turn you into a mirror of their own sophistication, reflecting the same emptiness with more and more style. But wisdom is not afraid of being simple. It is not afraid of being wrong. It is not afraid of stopping the echo. To end the echo is to go still, to go back, to sit with a thought long enough to watch it loosen, to notice which parts were grafted on, to notice what remains when the cleverness wears off. Sometimes what remains is small, humble, a quiet question in a room where everyone is performing answers, and that question, if you let it, can crack the mirror, because the truth doesn't echo. It doesn't need to. It speaks once, and everything after that is listening. There is a time of night when everything sounds profound. The mind, loosened from the grip of daylight logic, begins to wander through stranger corridors. You lie still in the dark, and suddenly a sentence arrives, soft, glowing, perfectly formed. It feels like revelation. It feels like genius. And in that moment, you believe you've seen something true. But not all insight that visits you in the dark deserves to follow you into the light. At 3 a.m., the mind no longer sorts thoughts by weight. It lets them drift. It lets them echo. A stupid idea can sound like philosophy if it arrives with the right rhythm, if it fits your exhaustion, if it explains something you didn't know needed explaining. And so you hold it close, not because it makes sense, but because it lands without resistance. Some ideas feel brilliant not because they are clear, but because they end a discomfort. They settle something that's been twitching in the background. They offer narrative where you only had noise, and in the stillness of night, that offering feels divine. But insight is not just a feeling. Insight survives interruption. It survives contradiction. It wakes up in the morning and still makes sense. Stupid ideas rarely do. They unravel with daylight. They dissolve in the presence of other voices. But at night they glow, and we mistake glow for truth. You've felt it, the sudden conclusion that rewrites everything, the theory that ties it all together, the phrase that feels like it should be carved into stone. And maybe it should be, but only if it still pulses with meaning when your body is awake. Because the night has a way of lowering the bar. It quiets the critic. It loosens the filter. And sometimes that's a gift. Sometimes your best ideas are the ones that slipped through while your mind was distracted. But sometimes what slips through is just well-dressed confusion. Stupid ideas often carry confidence. They arrive whole. They don't ask questions. They answer them. And we love answers in the dark. We crave them. We welcome them like company. But company isn't always clarity. Some thoughts stay simply because they're the only ones left standing when the noise fades. They linger not because they're right, but because they fit the silence. They match the tempo of your loneliness. And that fit feels like truth. This is not a failure. It is human. The brain is a meaning-making machine. When deprived of light, it will make constellations out of static. It will thread a story through anything. It will find a pattern because it needs one. And sometimes that story becomes a belief. You wake up and remember it. You hold on to it like a fragile artifact. You write it down. You share it. And if no one interrupts you, it hardens. But hardness is not evidence. A stupid idea with enough solitude becomes a philosophy. It starts to gather friends. You begin to protect it, explain it, defend it. It becomes part of how you describe the world. But you never stop to ask, what did this idea survive? Did it stand next to doubt? Did it pass through disagreement? Or did it simply arrive late at night and speak with the voice I wanted to hear? Genius does not fear the morning, but false brilliance flickers at sunrise. If the thought fades when questioned, if it cannot survive being spoken aloud, if it only glows in the quiet, you must ask yourself who it came to serve. Because not all ideas that feel right at 3 a.m. are meant to be believed. Some are meant to be listened to and released. Some are dreams in the shape of theories. Some are reflections of need, not understanding. And the wisest thing you can do is learn to hold them gently and let them go when the sky begins to change. There is an honesty in those 3 a.m. thoughts, even when they are wrong. They reveal what you don't say in daylight. They show you what you need, what you fear, what you're trying to name. And in that way, they are valuable, not because they are right, but because they are raw. But rawness is not revelation. It is the beginning of something, not the end. The trouble starts when you forget the difference, when you confuse emergence with insight, when you wake up and write it down in bold letters and begin to repeat it, before asking, what kind of silence did this grow in? What pain did this comfort? What longing does this explain too easily? Some ideas feel like closure not because they resolve, but because they distract. They stop the spinning, and that feels like peace. But you must be careful with peace. That comes too cheaply. You must be cautious with conclusions that appear fully formed, that require no friction, no reworking, no resistance, because real clarity can be inconvenient. It breaks the rhythm. It asks something new of you. It does not always arrive fully dressed. It often stumbles in, half-formed, blinking, needing to be shaped. And so we often choose the prettier lie, the smoother story, the idea that sings instead of stutters. You may carry one now, an idea that feels like it saved you once, that kept you company on the night when nothing else did, and you honored it, you kept it, you made it yours, but you are allowed to revisit it. You are allowed to ask, did it save me by being true or by being kind? Because there is a kind of kindness that is temporary, and there is another kind, the harder kind, that breaks you open before it steadies you. Sometimes what feels like genius at 3 a.m. was just a flashlight, shining briefly on the shape of your fear. But the light is not the truth. The truth is what remains after the glow fades and you still choose to look. Some of the most persuasive thoughts do not feel like choices. They arrive dressed as fairness, as neutrality, as wisdom refined through years of careful thinking. You trust them not because they ask for trust, but because they do not seem to ask anything at all. They present themselves as the ground, not the structure, as the lens, not the frame. But not all balance is balance. Not all neutrality is neutral. And some biases survive by learning how to sound like wisdom. You've heard them. The voice that says both sides when one side is bleeding. The voice that says not everything is black and white when something very much is. The voice that says it's complicated, not to open a deeper question, but to close one gently. These thoughts do not shout. They do not posture. They do not overreach. They simply tilt, a few degrees left or right, just enough to move the frame, to soften the edges, to delay the urgency. And in that tilt, entire truths are made less visible. Bias becomes invisible when it stops feeling like bias, when it is absorbed into tone, into language, into what questions we do and do not ask. It becomes the backdrop. And when you question it, people respond not with argument, but with confusion. They don't hear the bias, they hear reason. But reason can be inherited. And what sounds like wisdom is often just an accent learned from the people who taught you to sound smart. So you echo their phrasing, you mimic their calm, and you believe that because you do not raise your voice, you must be seeing clearly. But clarity is not volume, and quiet bias is still bias. It's the way some suffering gets described with distance, the way some pain must be proven to deserve attention, the way anger is labeled as emotion in one group and analysis in another. It's the invisible scale beneath the conversation, tipping the narrative before a word is spoken. You might find it in the way you hesitate to say something that feels true, in the way you revise your thoughts mid-sentence to seem more reasonable, in the way you frame your doubt as curiosity because certainty has been made to sound impolite. But wisdom is not politeness. Wisdom is not a tone. Wisdom does not always arrive in well-measured sentences. Sometimes wisdom interrupts. Sometimes it offends. Sometimes it speaks too soon, because something needed to be said. Before the window closed, invisible bias survives by waiting for the moment to pass. It whispers, "Let's wait until things calm down." It whispers, "Let's hear all perspectives." Even when one perspective is still being buried, it does not deny harm. It simply questions it until it becomes forgettable. And because it never lies directly, you mistake its pause for reflection. You call it careful. You call it thoughtful. You forget that it has a preference for the status quo, for the center, for the familiar. It wears the clothes of caution, but its caution is not for truth. It is for comfort. You are allowed to question what feels wise. You are allowed to notice who wisdom protects. You are allowed to ask what silences are being sold as patience. Because not every soft voice is neutral. Not every balanced tone is clear. And not everything dressed as wisdom was meant to help you see. Some of it was designed to help you look away. You are told to seek perspective, to gather more angles, to not rush to judgment. And these are good impulses until they become habits that keep you from ever choosing a position. There is a moment when seeking perspective becomes performance, when staying above the argument becomes a way to never risk being wrong. But truth does not always wait for perfect phrasing. It doesn't always dress itself in equal weight. Sometimes it arrives lopsided. Sometimes it demands to be spoken before it's been approved. Invisible bias teaches you to delay. It teaches you to sound fair while doing nothing. It rewards you for hesitation. And over time, hesitation becomes identity. You become the one who sees both sides. But some things don't have two sides. Some things have a wound and a hand holding the knife. The problem with bias that hides in the clothing of wisdom is that it makes you feel good. You feel responsible, mature, above the chaos. But you are not above it. You are inside it. You are standing on a scale that was tilted long before you arrived. And pretending the ground is level does not make it so. You may think you are protecting truth by staying calm, by staying neutral, by asking for more time. But sometimes you are just protecting yourself from discomfort, from conflict, from clarity. And clarity, when it finally arrives, does not always sound sophisticated. Sometimes it's blunt, sometimes it's angry, sometimes it's exactly what you were told wise people never say. But wisdom that cannot hold rage is not wisdom. Wisdom that cannot name injustice without apologizing for its tone is not wisdom. Wisdom that always speaks in a circle was never meant to move you forward. So look closely at what you've come to call measured. Look closely at what you've come to call balanced. And ask what you're trying to keep balanced, your perspective or your comfort. Because some truths are heavy, and they are meant to tip the scale. Certainty feels good. It warms the chest. It sharpens the spine. It gives shape to the formless and weight to the air. You hold a belief tightly enough, and it begins to feel like a structure, like something you could live inside. And so you do. You build a home out of your conclusions. You place furniture in the corners of your knowing. You hang pictures of your most refined thoughts on the walls. You sweep away the doubt that drifts in from the cracks. You decorate your certainty until it looks like character. But certainty can become a mask, beautiful, seamless, impossible to remove without tearing the skin beneath. It convinces you that to be wrong is to collapse, that to not know is to disappear. And so you defend it. You defend it even when it stops defending you. This is the arrogance of certainty, the belief that doubt is weakness, that revision is retreat, that silence in the face of mystery is a failure of intellect rather than a gesture of humility. It whispers that if you hesitate, you will fall, that if you pause, you will lose, that if you unlearn, you will unravel. But wisdom does not shout over questions. It kneels beside them. Certainty, left unchecked, begins to rot from the inside. It resists movement. It treats new information as intrusion. It surrounds itself with mirrors and calls it perspective. It rehearses the same lines and calls it consistency. It forgets that knowledge is alive, and you feel it, even if you don't say it aloud. The slow tightening, the fear of contradiction, the quiet rage when challenged. You defend not because you are sure, but because you are afraid of what unknowing might undo. But you are not made of your conclusions. You are not fragile scaffolding built to hold a single belief. You are the space between thoughts, the breath between sentences, the thing that notices change and still remains. There is a kind of strength that does not harden, a kind of clarity that does not defend itself. It waits, it expands, it allows itself to break open and be built again. Certainty, when it grows too proud, forgets this. It forgets how many things we were once sure of that turned out to be shadows. It forgets how many truths arrive disguised as contradictions. It forgets that being wrong is not a flaw of the mind, but the beginning of its evolution. To be certain is not the same as being grounded. Sometimes it is just being still in a place you're afraid to leave, but there is no arrival in thought. There is no final room. There are only doors, and the courage to walk through them, without needing to be right. Before you begin, certainty thrives in stillness, but not the kind that brings peace. It craves a stillness that silences challenge, a frozen room where no questions echo too loudly, where all mirrors return the same face. It wants agreement, not understanding. It wants repetition, not revelation. The arrogance of certainty is not always loud. Sometimes it speaks gently, with the calm of someone who has stopped listening. It offers answers like closed doors. It wraps its tone in kindness, but behind it is a refusal to change shape. And the longer it remains untested, the more sacred it becomes. You begin to mistake your beliefs for your identity. You forget where the thought ends and where you begin. You stop learning, not because the world is quiet, but because you no longer hear anything unfamiliar. But certainty does not equal truth. It only equals belief that has stopped moving. Real thought is porous. It breathes. It allows contradiction to pass through without destroying the whole. It asks, "What if I am wrong?" and waits for the answer, not defensively, not impatiently, but with the courage to lose something that once felt essential. Because if your clarity cannot survive being wrong, then it was never clarity, it was control. There is a humility in truth. It does not beg to be held. It does not punish you for letting go. It returns again and again, in different forms, with different faces, each time asking, "Are you still listening?" The most dangerous thing about certainty is that it works. It protects you from doubt. It shields you from shame. It gives you something to hold in the storm. But it also keeps you from seeing the sky. You are allowed to be wrong. You are allowed to change your mind. You are allowed to step out of the fortress you built and find that the world did not end. Only your need to always be right did. Some truths arrive like anchors. They hold you steady. They make sense of the storm. They give you something to stand on when everything else is shifting. And for a time they save you. But not all truths are meant to last forever. A truth can be right for a moment, for a chapter, for a version of yourself that no longer exists. It can serve its purpose. It can protect. It can illuminate. And then, quietly, without warning, it can expire. The trouble is, we rarely notice when it does. We carry old truths like heirlooms. We wrap them in memory. We mistake their age for authority. The longer they've been with us, the more real they feel, not because they still reflect the world, but because they've become part of our reflection. A truth believed for too long becomes something else. It hardens, it ritualizes, it stops adapting, and in that stillness it begins to distort. You feel it first in small ways, a discomfort when something doesn't fit, a friction between what you believe and what you're seeing. But instead of asking the truth to change, you ask reality to quiet down. Because it's easier to defend a familiar belief than to mourn it. We forget that truths, too, must be tested, that relevance has a shelf life, that what once helped you grow might now be holding you in place. But comfort makes poor criteria for truth, and consistency is not the same as clarity. Some truths get passed down like stories. At first they shine, but over time they become slogans. The words remain, but the meaning hollows. And still we repeat them, because repetition feels like safety, because shared belief feels like belonging. But inherited truths are still borrowed, and borrowed truths eventually ask to be returned. If you never open them, you don't know if they still hold. You might be living by coordinates for a map that no longer exists, and you'll wonder why your compass spins, why your path narrows, why your certainty starts to feel heavy instead of strong. There is no shame in letting a truth go. You are not betraying yourself. You are not discarding wisdom. You are making space. Space for what is true now, not what was true then. To evolve is to revisit everything you once believed was permanent, to hold it in your hands again, not with judgment, but with curiosity. Ask, is this still true, or just familiar? Does this expand me, or just echo me? Truth that no longer breathes is not truth. It is memory. It is protection. It is structure without soul. You can thank it for what it gave you. And then, if it no longer opens something in you, let it be a stepping stone, not a wall. Because some truths are not wrong, only complete. Some truths don't die loudly. They fade. They grow quiet inside you. They stop answering the new questions you're asking. But you keep them anyway, like an old coat you never wear, afraid of what it would mean to finally put it down. You wear it because it once kept you warm. You forget to ask if it still fits. There are truths that held you together when you were coming apart. They helped you survive. They offered meaning when there was none. But truths born from pain often carry the shape of that pain. And when the pain dissolves, the belief remains, rigid and unchanged. Eventually, the life you're living grows larger than the truth that once defined it. And yet you keep shrinking yourself to fit. This is not loyalty. This is fear of the empty shelf. Because what lives under an expired truth is uncertainty. And uncertainty asks you to build again, to name again, to walk without the path already drawn. But something beautiful lives in that undoing. When you release a truth that no longer serves you, you rediscover what it means to think, to see, to meet the world without script. It doesn't mean you never believed. It means you believed deeply. And now you're still growing. Letting go is not rejection. It is continuation. And what is truly wise will not punish you for evolving. It will recognize itself in the version of you that was brave enough to move on. Some beliefs endure not because they are true, but because they know how to speak. They wear the tone of wisdom. They sound like something you've heard before. They echo the cadence of authority, the rhythm of what gets quoted, the style of what gets shared. And so we believe them, not because they hold weight, but because they fit so well into the architecture of thought we've already built. A belief that sounds right doesn't ask to be tested. It skips the examination. It arrives with confidence. And in a world that rewards fluency, confidence often feels like clarity. These are the beliefs that thrive in smooth sentences, in metaphors so elegant they go unchallenged, in slogans, in diagrams, in TED Talks. They do not demand evidence. They suggest inevitability. We hold on to them not because we've traced them back to their source, but because they give us the relief of agreement. And agreement, when repeated enough times, starts to feel like truth. But repetition is not truth, it's only rhythm. And rhythm can carry anything, even emptiness. The most convincing beliefs are the ones that blend in, that don't sound radical, but refined, that feel old enough to be safe and modern enough to be clever. They survive scrutiny by evading it, not through resistance, but through familiarity. And we nod again and again until we forget what we're agreeing to. Some beliefs become furniture. You stop seeing them. They shape the room. They determine the path you take through your own thinking. And when someone questions them, you don't defend them with evidence. You defend them with tone. You say, "That's just how it is." You say, "Everyone knows that." You say, "Come on, be reasonable." But reason dressed in consensus can still be wrong. A belief that survives only because it's pleasing is not a belief. It's a lullaby, and lullabies are not meant to wake you. They're meant to keep you still. Sometimes what you believe is not yours. It is a voice you absorbed, because it made the world feel simpler. But simplicity is not the same as understanding. And understanding is not the same as stopping the question. The most dangerous beliefs are the ones that no longer feel like beliefs, the ones that feel like air, the ones that hide inside language so casual. You forget to look at what they're hiding. Ask yourself, when was the last time this belief surprised me? When was the last time it struggled to hold itself together? When was the last time I saw it from underneath? Because the beliefs that are still alive can still be shaken. They don't crumble. They deepen. But the ones that only survive by sounding right begin to collapse. The moment you listen without nodding. Some beliefs aren't kept alive by logic, but by rhythm. They've learned to move with the current of what feels acceptable, respectable, shareable. They adapt not by growing deeper, but by becoming harder to notice. They survive in group conversations, in professional tones and advice columns. They survive in the way we nod before someone has finished speaking, in the phrases that end discussions instead of opening them. And the longer they go unquestioned, the more sacred they become. Not sacred because they elevate, but sacred because they are untouchable. You stop challenging them, not because they passed the test, but because no one ever dared to test them at all. This is how belief becomes choreography, a series of mental steps passed down, performed without thought, praised without pause. And you feel smart doing it. You feel composed. You feel safe, because sounding right is rewarded. But truth doesn't care how well it's said. Truth often stutters. Truth contradicts the tone. Truth doesn't always arrive dressed for the TED stage. Sometimes it's blunt, sometimes it interrupts, sometimes it makes you look foolish before it makes you free. So let your beliefs shake. Let them stammer. Let them be ugly for a moment. Let them sound wrong long enough to become something real. Some beliefs wear the tone of truth so convincingly that even your doubt becomes quiet in their presence. You find yourself repeating them, not because they've been tested, but because they've been beautifully phrased. You tell yourself, it just makes sense. And sometimes that's all it takes. But making sense is not the same as being rooted. Some ideas only survive because they've never been asked to stand still long enough to be examined. They move fast. They move smoothly. They match the tempo of conversation. They land well in meetings. They sound good in your own voice. And after a while, you forget where you first heard them. They're just part of how you talk now. And slowly, they become part of how you see. That's how belief works. Not as a decision, but as an accumulation. The danger isn't just in what these ideas say. It's in how easily they dodge the question, how do I know this is mine? And by the time you wonder, they've already framed too much of your thinking to be pulled out cleanly. But truth doesn't fear the pull. It doesn't need to sound right. It only needs to remain. After all, the elegance is stripped away. So let yourself mishear your own thoughts. Let them sound strange again. Let them clunk. Let them collapse under a question. They should have answered long ago. Because belief, when it is real, survives awkwardness. It survives slow explanation. It survives being misunderstood, and still finds a way to be lived. There is a way to be wrong that earns applause, a way of speaking that dresses error in elegance. The phrasing is clean, the tone composed, the logic tight enough to impress but loose enough to escape inspection. You may not notice the flaw at first because the flaw is veiled in grace. This is the art of being wrong with style, of constructing a belief so polished, so well delivered, that even those who disagree hesitate to interrupt. It feels convincing, it feels sharp, and so we let it pass. But delivery is not depth, and elegance is not truth. You can be completely wrong and still sound correct if your voice doesn't tremble. You can dress a hollow idea in the rhythm of intelligence. You can choreograph your thinking to feel like progress. And if you do it well enough, no one will notice that you've said nothing new. We reward poise. We reward coherence. We reward those who speak as if they've already considered every angle, even when they haven't, even when their argument is a circle, well lit and echoing. And over time, we learn to imitate that tone, to speak before we're ready, to conclude before we've begun. We call it clarity, we call it leadership, we call it insight. But often it is simply performance. The mind loves certainty wrapped in charisma. We're drawn to voices that sound like conclusions, and when an idea arrives dressed in style, we stop asking what it's made of. We stop listening for the structure beneath it. We become enchanted by the architecture and forget to ask if it's built on air. You can be wrong with style for years. You can build a career on it, a following, a philosophy, and never once be asked to sit in the discomfort of reconsidering. Because reconsideration is messy. It stutters, it doubts, it loses the room. But that is where truth often begins, where performance ends. We fear being wrong, not just because of the fall, but because of the silence that follows. Because once the performance ends, we have to ask, what am I, if not the voice that was always sure? To be wrong without style feels like failure, but to be wrong with style feels like success. It lets you keep the illusion. But wisdom does not grow in illusion. Wisdom arrives after the embarrassment, after unraveling, after that sentence you couldn't finish because suddenly you weren't sure anymore. There is an honesty in that pause. There is a truth in the breath that comes before correction. You can learn more from being wrong, honestly, than from being right performatively. And style, for all its polish, cannot teach you how to listen. So speak if you must. But let your voice wobble. Let your certainty hesitate. Let your thoughts look unfinished. Because being wrong, without style, is often the most honest thing you'll ever do. We mistake elegance for effort. We think that if a thought is well spoken, it must have been well earned. But style is easy to mimic. It's a mask that speaks fluently in public and never flinches under lights. And the world claps for that. Not because it's right, but because it's familiar. Being wrong with style allows you to stay untouched. It turns conversation into performance. It turns dialogue into a script. No risk, no cost. Only the rhythm of knowing without knowing. But underneath the costume, something slowly hardens. You stop feeling your own thoughts from the inside. You speak from the scaffolding of belief without testing whether it still holds. Because when wrongness is disguised well enough, you no longer feel wrong. You just feel listened to. And so the performance continues. You become fluent in avoidance. You learn to redirect, reframe, retreat gracefully. You practice being the kind of wrong that never has to apologize. But apology is not weakness. It is a form of learning. It is the body remembering how to soften. It is the ego exhaling. To be wrong without style is to be human, to be raw, to be reachable. That is where the deeper knowing begins. Not in the sentence that wins, but in the silence after it, where something inside you says, I want to get this right more than I want to appear right. There is a kind of thinking that does not seek truth, only safety. It does not reach outward, it folds inward. It speaks not to explore but to protect. This is reasoning used not as a bridge but as a wall. It begins with discomfort, a question you don't want to hold, a feeling that arrives without language, raw, vulnerable, too loud to ignore. So the mind intervenes. It builds a ladder of logic, fast and sharp, up and away from the source. It stacks explanations like sandbags around a thought. You cannot bear to feel directly, and suddenly you're not thinking to understand. You're thinking to escape. You turn the ache into an argument. You turn uncertainty into a case to be won. You stack citations between you and your grief. You call it clarity, but it's distance. The mind is clever this way. It knows how to redirect the current of pain into patterns that feel productive. It knows how to give the illusion of engagement while quietly retreating from anything that could actually move you. You argue about the structure of the question to avoid its implications. You debate the language to avoid what the language is pointing at. You stay on the surface because the depth is too sharp. And the world applauds this because we reward intellect, even when it is hollow, even when it is armor. You begin to mistake logic for integrity. You believe that because you have an answer, you must have dealt with the feeling. But reasoning can be used to keep emotion at arm's length. It can be dressed in the tone of objectivity, while silently hiding fear. You call it thinking, but it's rehearsing. You call it insight, but it's evasion. Not all reasoning is defense, but when your argument repeats itself in circles, when your conclusions always lead away from discomfort, when your logic becomes more polished as the questions grow heavier, that is when you must pause. Ask, what am I protecting? What part of me cannot afford to sit in silence with this? Because truth does not arrive wrapped in arguments. It often arrives trembling. It often speaks through your body before it forms in words. And you cannot logic your way into feeling. You can only stop resisting it long enough to hear what it's been trying to say. To reason well is not to never feel. It is to let feeling guide the direction of the question, without letting fear rewrite the map. Some truths cannot be constructed. They must be felt slowly in the places where the thinking stops and something older begins. Let yourself be quiet there. Let your logic loosen its grip. Let the question be more important than the answer. Let the pain speak without needing to be solved, because real clarity does not protect you from what hurts. It lets you face it without armor. Reasoning becomes defense when it is used to stay in control. When every answer is a shield, when every conclusion is a way to avoid saying, I don't know what to do with this feeling. We build logic like scaffolding over the ache. We polish it. We admire its symmetry. And then we climb it, trying to stay above what we were supposed to feel through. But there are some things logic cannot lift. There are some questions that grow heavier. The more cleanly we try to explain them away. You cannot outthink sorrow. You cannot outmaneuver grief. You cannot debate your way around your own vulnerability. And yet we try, because to reason is to feel powerful. To reason is to feel composed. But truth is not always composed. Sometimes truth is trembling. Sometimes truth is the word you almost said but swallowed. Sometimes truth is the silence after your explanation, the part of you that still isn't okay, even after you've made a good point. There is intelligence in allowing what hurts to speak plainly. There is wisdom in not dressing your wounds in analysis. Not everything is a problem to solve. Not every contradiction needs a resolution. Some things just need to be witnessed. When you stop using reasoning to keep truth at a distance, something else opens, something quieter, something that doesn't need to argue its way into the room. It just needs you to stop talking long enough, to hear what never learned, how to ask. That is where real thought begins. Not in the defense, but in the surrender. There are beliefs we carry not because they are true, but because they are useful, because they help things move forward, because they keep us from freezing in uncertainty, because they sound like realism in a world that punishes pause. We call them practical, we call them mature, we call them necessary. But some lies do not arrive as deception. They arrive as compromise, as wisdom wrapped in restraint, as a way to avoid drowning in complexity by building a raft of what works. This is the noble lie. Not spoken with malice, but with tired compassion. Not told to mislead, but to preserve momentum. A lie told to the self, so the system doesn't collapse. A lie maintained by many, so that no one has to say aloud what everyone quietly fears. It sounds like, we have to be realistic. It's not ideal, but it's the only way. That's just how the world works. And no one disagrees. Because disagreement feels naive. Because hope has been rebranded as immaturity. Because dreaming too clearly has become an inconvenience. So we nod, we compromise, we call the trade-off wisdom. And the longer the lie survives, the more it looks like policy, like economics, like strategy, like adulthood. But just because something works doesn't mean it's worth keeping. Just because a structure holds doesn't mean it holds anything worth building. We wear pragmatism like armor, not because we are brave, but because we've been disappointed so many times. We no longer trust what's beautiful, unless it looks exhausted. And so the noble lie becomes the standard. We speak in its language. We plan around its limitations. We teach our children not to hope too loudly, because hope might embarrass us, because desire might disrupt the schedule, because truth might ask us to build something less efficient, but more alive. But aliveness cannot be measured in metrics, and meaning does not always fit the budget. Some truths are not productive. Some truths slow us down. Some truths ask us to stop winning for a moment, so we can remember why we started. You may carry a noble lie right now, not because you are weak, but because you were told it was strength. You were told that realism means letting go of what makes your heart ache when silenced. But realism is not the absence of vision. It is the tension between what is and what could still be, if you were willing to name it. A noble lie often begins as protection, but over time it becomes the reason nothing changes. So ask, what am I calling pragmatic? Because I've stopped believing in what's possible and what might happen if I let the lie go and began again with something that dared to want more. The noble lie is not loud. It doesn't demand allegiance. It simply waits for your hope to shrink enough to seem embarrassing. It whispers that your vision is too much, that your expectations are a threat, that compromise is a virtue even when it becomes your personality. You start small, cutting corners on your dreams, sanding down your ideals until they fit more easily in your mouth. You call it growing up. You call it adjusting to reality. And perhaps it is. but only if reality is defined by exhaustion and not by imagination made patient. The noble lie survives because it gives us something to stand on when we are tired of floating in the unknown. But a platform made of resignation does not lift you. It traps you in what is survivable rather than what is transformative. It teaches you to plan for less and call it wisdom. It teaches you to expect little and call it resilience. But true resilience does not live in diminished expectations. It lives in the tension between vision and friction. It survives in the willingness to want fully. Even in a world that has learned to smirk at wanting, you are allowed to hold both. The system and the yearning, the limit and the longing, the practicality and the pulse beneath it. That says, even this is not enough. Because if you lie to yourself for long enough, even kindly, even nobly, you forget you ever wanted more. And a life that forgets its own desire will always mistake endurance for peace. There is a kind of agreement that feels like harmony. Smooth, clean, unanimous, no resistance, no tension, a warm current moving in one direction. It feels safe, it feels mature, it feels like the right thing must have been said. But not all agreement is clarity. Sometimes it's coordination, sometimes it's fear. When everyone agrees, you must ask, what did we silence to get here? Because not all consensus comes from truth. Some comes from exhaustion, from social choreography, from the need to keep things moving. Agreement can be a performance, a ritual of nodding, a room full of minds folding themselves down until nothing sticks out. You feel it when you hesitate to speak, not because you are unsure, but because you are too sure it won't land. You know the script has already been written. You don't want to interrupt the rhythm. And so you go quiet. You tell yourself it wasn't important. You tell yourself you'll bring it up later. But later never feels quite right. Because momentum is persuasive, and stillness can feel like betrayal. The most dangerous beliefs are not the loudest. They are the ones no one questions. The ones passed around like air. Too basic to examine, too accepted to hold. When everyone agrees, it becomes difficult to remember that something else was ever possible. And sometimes what survives is not what was most thoughtful, but what was easiest to agree with. This is how false certainty grows, not from coercion, but from comfort, from being surrounded by people who all need the same story to keep their sense of belonging intact. We call it unity, but sometimes it's just synchronized silence. You've likely agreed for the wrong reason before. Not because you believed, but because the moment asked for smoothness, because doubt felt like friction, because honesty felt impolite. And so you smiled, you nodded, you folded yourself in, just enough to match the room. But rooms like that don't stay rooms. They become echo chambers. They become soundproof containers for outdated truths. And the longer they stay unchallenged, the more fragile they become. They must be defended, maintained, preserved by those too scared to reopen the question. But the question is still alive. It waits in your throat. It waits in the breath you didn't take, in the words you edited mid-sentence, to avoid the glance across the table. Agreement without friction is often just fear wearing diplomacy. True understanding does not require uniformity. It does not panic when someone disagrees. It does not mistake a pause for a threat. So ask yourself, what am I agreeing to? And why? Is it because I believe it, or because I'm tired of being the one? Who ruins the mood? Agreement should not be comfortable, because everyone lowered their voice. It should be earned, because everyone said what they truly meant, even when it shook the air. Because that kind of tension, the honest, tender, irreducible difference, that is what turns a conversation into something that breathes. Fear rarely says its name directly. It comes in disguise, dressed in theories, armed with vocabulary, wearing glasses and speaking in citations. It doesn't tremble, it explains. It doesn't scream, it constructs. This is the intellectualization of fear. When you feel something too big to hold, so you analyze it instead. You turn it into a diagram, into an abstraction, into a clever idea, and suddenly you're not afraid. You're thinking. You are breaking the experience down into clean parts. You are observing from a safe distance. You are mapping the terrain instead of walking through it. And for a while, that works. You feel in control. You sound composed. You even impress yourself. But what you don't feel is the fear. Not directly, not honestly, because intellectualization is a kind of armor. It says, if I can understand this, I won't have to feel it. If I can explain it, it won't undo me. But some fears aren't meant to be solved. Some are meant to be felt all the way through. Wild, raw, wordless, we are conditioned to rise above emotion, to elevate thinking, to treat analysis as safety. And it is a kind of safety dash, a brilliant, subtle, socially rewarded escape. But when fear is disguised as intellect, it still shapes your life. Only now, you're calling it insight. You begin to believe you've processed something, because you've named it, because you've quoted someone wiser, because you've spoken in the language of detachment. But detachment is not healing, and knowledge is not integration. You can explain the mechanism of a fire and still burn. You can describe your panic and never touch it. This is the trick. Intellectualized fear doesn't stop you from feeling afraid. It just stops you from admitting it. And in that denial, the fear grows quieter, but heavier. It becomes the weight behind your overthinking. It becomes the tension in your questions. It becomes the voice that always finds the bigger picture, so it doesn't have to speak. The small, trembling truth. You can feel the difference. When your words carry life, and when they carry defense. When your insight is generous, and when it is hiding something. Not all intellect is avoidance, but the intellect that refuses to feel is often just fear in formal wear. You are allowed to take off the performance. You are allowed to say, I am afraid. I don't have a theory for this. You are allowed to cry without a metaphor, to shiver without a framework, to name what hurts without explaining it away. Because some feelings are not puzzles to be solved. They are visitors. They ask to be met, not diagrammed, and they will not leave until you look them in the eyes and stop narrating and just say, yes, I feel it, and stay. The mind wants to be useful. It wants to do something when fear arrives. So it offers words. It builds ladders of logic to climb out of feeling. It says, "Let me find the angle. Let me define this before it defines me." But sometimes there is no angle. Sometimes the fear has no lesson yet. Sometimes it isn't a signal. It's just the body saying, "You are vulnerable," and that's still true. But vulnerability has become a problem to solve. We treat it like an error in the code. So we try to patch it with paragraphs. We create frameworks instead of space. We schedule reflection. We give clever names to what we're too scared to touch. And in doing so, we move further from the wound. You might be speaking beautifully about your pain and still be miles from it. You might be sharing everything, except the one sentence that would break your voice. You might be so good at explaining that no one knows you're still terrified. And maybe that's the point. Maybe that's the refuge, to seem composed while drowning. But healing begins, where language begins to fail, where the thought stutters, where the theory thins, and the silence finally arrives. You do not have to be wise all the time. You are allowed to tremble, to forget the right terms, to be messy and scared and unrehearsed. You are allowed to feel before you understand, and to not understand at all, because real courage is not the ability to name your fear. In perfect language, it's the willingness to sit in its heat with nothing prepared to say. Some thoughts sparkle with intelligence. They move elegantly, circle themselves with precision, reference the right things, use the right words, and leave you feeling like you've missed something, even when there's nothing there. This is sophisticated nonsense, the kind of thinking that builds tall towers on invisible ground, the kind that sounds profound but collapses under quiet questions. It's not always a lie. It doesn't always mean to deceive. Often it's born from the genuine desire to sound clear. Before becoming clear, we fear appearing simple, so we dress our uncertainty in complexity. We stack abstractions on top of confusion until the whole thing looks solid, and then we admire it because it took effort to build. But effort does not equal meaning. Complexity does not equal depth. And language, when too smooth, can start to cover rather than reveal. You may find yourself nodding along to something that feels wise, but resists translation. That explains the world, but cannot survive being rephrased. That impresses, but does not illuminate. This is the trick. You can sound smart without touching truth. You can memorize the shape of insight without holding its weight. You can become fluent in thought. That leads nowhere. Sophisticated nonsense thrives in systems that reward performance, in institutions, in commentary, in rooms where the fear of looking wrong is stronger than the desire to ask again. It lives in language that loops, that reframes without answering, that defines every term, so that no definition can be questioned. It's difficult to challenge, not because it is solid, but because it is slippery. You reach for it, and it offers another abstraction. You follow it, and it offers another metaphor. You question it, and it accuses you of being too literal. But wisdom is not afraid of being understood. It wants to be lived, not admired. It wants to touch the ground, not orbit it. Sophisticated nonsense avoids gravity. It prefers the air. It prefers the echo of its own brilliance. And the more it is praised, the more it grows. In complexity, in confidence, in distance. But distance is not insight. And if a thought cannot survive the question, what does this mean to me, here, now? Then it is not thought. It is theater. You can feel the difference. When a truth lands, it lands. It does not ask for applause. It does not hide behind vocabulary. It simply remains, quietly, even when the cleverness fades. So be suspicious of what dazzles. Be cautious with what cannot be explained plainly. And remember, the most honest ideas are often the ones you could tell a child without losing anything. We learn to respect what confuses us. We're told that if we don't understand, it must be because we're not ready, not smart enough, not deep enough, not trained in the right school of thought. So we nod, and we pretend the meaning is just out of reach, like a constellation we're not tall enough to name. But confusion isn't always a teacher. Sometimes it's a costume. Sometimes it's a fog poured over emptiness, designed to make us question our clarity, instead of the speaker's intention. This is how nonsense survives, not by hiding, but by becoming a style, a kind of brilliance that doesn't illuminate, a performance, so practiced that even its emptiness shines. You begin to copy it. You learn the posture. You decorate your sentences with the right kind of uncertainty, the one that sounds open, but never lets anything in. You learn to ask questions that don't need answers. You become clever at staying nowhere. But wisdom is not afraid of direction. It knows what it's trying to reach. It welcomes being corrected. It does not need mystery to feel important. You can be simple without being shallow. You can be clear and still be profound. And maybe the bravest thing you can say is not a perfect metaphor, not a layered abstraction, not a dazzling theory, but simply, I don't know. Can we stay here and figure it out together? Because truth doesn't need to impress. It just needs to be found. And once found, it rarely needs more than a few quiet words to be heard. The voice in your head learned to speak long before you knew it was speaking. It picked up rhythm before you picked up language. It studied your teachers, your parents, your culture, your fears. It earned credentials without you noticing. It wore authority the way others wore uniforms. And one day you mistook it for yourself. It doesn't yell. It's calm, academic, reasonable. It presents its thoughts in outlines, labels its paragraphs, cites its anxieties with footnotes. It speaks with the fluency of someone who has been believed before. It sounds smart, it sounds right, it sounds like truth, because it sounds like education. But credentials are not clarity, and intelligence is not always aligned with honesty. The voice in your head knows how to think. It knows how to win arguments you never meant to start. It knows how to interpret silence as evidence. It knows how to spin doubt into logic. It knows how to sound like your best thinking, while keeping you inside a very narrow room. It didn't mean to trap you. It meant to protect you. But in protecting you from chaos, it often protects you from change. And in protecting you from being wrong, it protects you from learning. You gave it authority because it sounded familiar. It mirrored what you were taught to admire. A composed tone, a measured pace, a structured mind. It passed all the tests. But that doesn't mean it knows the answers. You may find it speaking when no one is asking, filling quiet moments with unsolicited commentary, interrupting your instincts with statistics, explaining your feelings. As if they were case studies, it edits you. It narrates before you can act. It warns you of what others might think, before you've even thought for yourself. And because it sounds educated, you assume it must be evolved. But intelligence without intimacy is still a stranger. This voice doesn't know what moves you. It only knows what organizes you. It sorts, it frames, it defines, but it does not feel. And when you begin to feel, truly, messily, wordlessly, it gets nervous. It starts talking again. It reminds you what's logical. It reminds you what's reasonable. It reminds you what smart people don't do. But smart is not the same as awake. Smart is not the same as free. Sometimes the wisest thing you can do is ignore the voice that sounds smartest. Sometimes you must interrupt it mid-sentence and say, "I don't want a summary. I want to live this." Because not every experience needs to be explained. Not every impulse needs to be narrated. Not every decision needs to be pre-approved. By the counsel of your internal committee, you are allowed to speak from the chest, not the outline. You are allowed to feel without a quote, to want without a thesis, to change without a memo. The voice in your head got a degree, but that doesn't mean it understands you. It might know how to protect you. It might know how to convince others. It might know how to keep you safe by sounding certain. But it does not know what you haven't yet discovered. It does not know how to grow. It only knows how to organize what's already inside, and what's already inside may need to break to make room for what's coming. So you must notice when the voice starts teaching, while you are still listening, when it starts correcting, while you are still wondering, when it begins dismissing what hasn't yet finished becoming. You do not have to silence it. You only have to stop mistaking it for the whole of you. You are not the voice. You are the one hearing it. And beyond the commentary, beyond the credentials, beyond the structure, there is something quieter. It doesn't speak in full sentences. It doesn't cite. It doesn't score points. It simply waits. It hums. It holds. It doesn't try to be smart. It doesn't try to be right. It only tries to be real. And when you finally stop listening to the polished lecture, you may hear it again. That smaller voice, that child, that animal, that intuition. It will not sound like something you were taught. It will not impress a room. It will not pass a test. But it will feel like home, and maybe that is the only truth you were ever meant to follow.